Well, welcome everybody. It's good to welcome you here to Ridley College. Thanks to Ridley for hosting this afternoon. We're expecting a few more people, so you may need to squash up. It was booked out, but there's still some seats. They'll probably...
Clearly no one wants to sit in the front.
No, they're all Anglicans. They don't want to sit in the front.
It's an Anglican congregation. No one sits in the front.
It's very different to Greek Orthodoxy.
They all wander around in Greek Orthodox.
They wander around, but everyone
Don't
just
give them
kind of
ideas.
rushes to the front.
No, in Anglican churches, we don't want them wandering around. And we are recording this tonight, so Chris from TMA is here, and we're going to put that up, I think, on YouTube, isn't it, Chris, rather than a podcast. So other people who are not here, friends, you may want to refer them to that in a little bit of time. And we'll be writing up a summary of this conversation for March's TMA, and there'll also, we think, be a review of the book in March TMA by Bob Derenbacher as well. Christos, we're very thankful to you for coming along. We're trying to work out who's the most nervous person sitting at the front here. I think I'm the most nervous. But Christos was very keen to engage with what church is thinking about his book and so on. And we're very pleased to have Fergus King, who lectures at Trinity College, and Brian Rosner, who's the principal here at Ridley, both of whom have taught and written and published and so on in Paul studies. So we're looking forward to an interesting, I hope, conversation this afternoon. And I know at the end, Christos is happy to sign books if you brought them. We had thought there were going to be books here to sell, but they've not yet turned up. I guess they won't. But we encourage you to buy the book. And if you brought one with you, as some of you I see have, then Christos is happy to sign it at the end as well. I thought, to get things underway, Christos, I thought I'd just ask, I know some of this is in the public domain, but where did your interest in Paul begin?
Well, I guess because it is in the... you always get a little... I don't want. A lot of you may have heard some of this, so I don't want to bore you. But it is important that Paul is one of those figures that has been. I grew up Greek Orthodox. I grew up in Richmond, so in Burnley Street, which was the church we used to go to. He was the figure in the icon. But I didn't really know anything else about Paul until. And this was quite pivotal as autobiography, really. Is at 13, we moved from Richmond to Box Hill North, and I started attending in Year 8 Blackburn High. And I think that dislocation, because one, you're 13, so you've already developed friendships and a world, and you're moving somewhere else. And at that time, very, very different to now. The area was a complete contrast to what I grew up in Richmond, which then was a very heavily migrant area.
Yeah.
And that wasn't the case in Blackburn. And I fell in, and this is really important to say, a wonderful woman my age who was the first person to extend friendship to me, and she invited me along to a prayer group, a Bible studies group that they had, which was my first encounter with Protestantism, really, as well. Just to explain, I actually sat down just the other month with Mum after I had written Damascus and had come out, and shame on me, I'd realised that I'd assumed she knew a history that I have been fortunate to learn through education. And I actually explained Protestantism to her, and it was remarkable that she didn't know that history. So I just wanted to place that in context. Sometimes we forget how to translate to a lot of people who live in this society, kind of these differences that we assume we assume we know. Anyway, I joined this Bible study at school, and then it was attached to a Baptist church at Blackburn. And I became Christian. I had assumed God as a good Greek Orthodox boy, but I had never really thought about faith. And I did start thinking about faith, but I had what happened was I was in this conflict with another thing that was emerging quite strongly, which was my sexuality. And my encounter with Paul, to get to your question, was I couldn't read him because of the injunction against homosexuality in Corinthians. It was like I could not, this is how I've described it, and it's really true. I read him, like I would read, this was part of Bible study, but I couldn't read him, I couldn't listen to him. And at 15, so a year and a half after really doing a huge battle with faith, I gave up on God. I couldn't reconcile my sexuality with what I thought God wanted. And it was an immense struggle. And, at 54, you look back with a little bit of puzzlement at that child back then. And but to give you a sense of how intense it was, I would lie in bed. And I just said to the guys, I'm rereading Augustine's Confessions at the moment, and kind of the battle with lust. And I thought lust was the devil inside me, and I would give myself over to lust, to masturbation, and then I would scratch myself till I bled, like just to get the devil outside. So that was how intense in the body the experience was. So, and I gave up on God until my late 20s, and I thought I would not ever be thinking about Paul again or Christianity again. And I was in a moment of despair, and I walked into a church across the road from where I was working. It was a uniting church, and I fell into prayer, and I hadn't prayed for a long time, and I fell into a howling, and that is actually true. That's the experience. And I picked up the Bible. I picked up the New Testament because that was what was there, and I started reading, and I heard Paul for the first time. And he gave me just a sense of peace. So Damascus, that's a long time ago, right? That's over 20, maybe 25 years ago. But I think the germ of Damascus came from that experience of trying to reconcile those two experiences of Paul. And really, sorry, because I can go on, but I think this is important. When I gave up faith in God, because I couldn't give up faith, and I actually took up another faith, which was communism, that was what it was, actually. That's exactly what it was. And one of you asked me about Dead Europe. Was that my first novel? No, it was my third novel, but I think Dead Europe is the closest book to Damascus, because that's also about Dead Europe I wrote after the collapse of communism and travelling through Eastern Europe, and also realising I had lost that faith, and I felt shamed about things that I had espoused after I was speaking to Eastern people who had lived under these regimes. But it also brought me to a closer relationship of thinking about Christianity and what faith is.
So coming to the book Damascus, you quoted somewhere as saying you were wrestling with Paul, and then you fell in step with him, or walked in step with him. So has writing Damascus changed your view of Paul?
Yeah, I've become, the reason I'm nervous is I'm with the three of you and your theologians, right? So right? So, and I mean, the nerves are absolutely, terrifying. But
you don't need to be terrified.
You've got to understand that there's the. So I've grown up in this society, and Paul, I've been reading for a long time, and I have been reading theology for a long time, and I've been reading philosophy for a long time, and I've been reading history for a long time. And I know that Paul is seen, in some ways, in quite negative ways, as the instigator of, as pivotal for the misogyny of the church, for the experience I had as a homosexual in faith, even for anti-Semitism, for the lot. And in writing Damascus, in thinking about him as a man, not a saint, not the very stern icon, in the Orthodox Church, I feel very defensive of him now. That isn't to say that I'm not instill in argument. But I think, and God, I think this is really important in this present age. I think you can argue without wrestling. You can actually argue and be in step with someone. And that's how I feel about Paul.
It's interesting. I want to ask you a little bit about writing historical fiction. So we understand poetic license. The historical facts always have gaps in narrative. I noticed, trivial things, but I'm a pedant.
Go for it.
So Lydia in Philippi goes down to the sea. That's a long walk in reality.
Yes.
I thought you sort of moved Philippi a few kilometres south, probably. But that's all right. I could live with that. But then,
don't I say that they actually go to they live in at the edge of the port in Philippi. So,
yes, but Philippi's back inland a bit.
Yes.
Kavala or Neapolis was the port town, I guess. But that's all right. I can cope with that. I just changed my map, and so on. But I'm wondering when you're writing, in effect, about an historical event. So the conversion of Paul, one of your chapters is focused on that. But it doesn't quite fit how I would read the conversion in the Acts of the Apostles. So Paul seems actually not quite converted. He seems sort of very reluctant, blinded, but not really converted. So as you write that, are you just using poetic license to create a good chapter that's gripping and interesting? Are you sort of drawing away from, say, the reports in Acts of the Apostles because you want to keep us awake as we're reading and make us read something new and open our eyes? Are you trying to bring your own interpretation, or is it just telling a good yarn?
Probably of the least important thing in one way is telling a good yarn, because I didn't. With this book, it wasn't enough to tell a good story.
Yep.
I felt a certain responsibility to the fact that I'd chosen a kind of the chutzpah of writing about Paul, right, and about writing about the development of the early church. I spent a lot of time researching and reading and thinking about the book before I even lifted the pen. And then when I started writing the first draft, I tried to remain faithful to the experience that Paul talks about in his letters, about the conversion experience, and it was dead on the page. And it was dead on the page because I didn't believe it, and it wasn't until actually really that was one of the major changes between the first and the second draft was my having to go, what is this story I want to tell? And there's a selfish instinct in the writer, which is I'm doing this for myself. So I want to understand what would make a man in the first century leave behind his faith, his people, his religion, his home, take the road. That's an astonishing thing. Maybe it is that and there is something about that blinding moment on the road to Damascus that I wanted to remain faithful to. But my experience of faith, and I've given you two stories about how I understand faith, is that it's that blinding of light is not enough, because then you fall back into doubt. I don't know how you go. I just, and in fact, I'm quite terrified of people who don't fall into doubt.
Okay. Right.
So the story I wanted to tell was also a story about doubt, and I trusted that Paul would, I trusted that he doubted. It's in his letters, and it's.
It's interesting. One of my later questions was going to be, one of the things I found frustrating was the lack of confidence in Paul, and to a degree in Timothy, although the New Testament shows letters to Timothy rather than Timothy speaking or writing. So, but the lack of confidence, Paul's letters are full of confidence of faith. No doubt he doubted. I just felt maybe the balance had shifted that made me uncomfortable?
I mean, that's all I can, to that, Paul, I can answer is that for me, one of the most important pieces of writing in the book is the final part of Paul heading to Rome, right? And for me, from the very beginning of thinking through what this novel is and actually thinking through it of a story, I wanted to have that. I knew that was going to be the final image of him on the ship, and that he had to communicate to us the light he was in, which is that confidence.
Yes, I like the ending.
It's interesting, and I actually will ask the three of you about this, because I got a lovely letter from a Catholic priest the other day, right? And he was responding to Damascus, and it's been a real joy that people have been doing this, because the other thing I was going to say to you, in terms of, poetic license and writing fiction, I knew that this book was, if you like, heretical, but I was actually really clear in my mind. I didn't want it to be blasphemous. I didn't want to. I wanted to tell the story in good faith. Like, I didn't want it to be some kind of merciless or ugly or attack on Paul and those early Christians, if we can call them that. Anyway, this priest wrote to me, and he said there's something about the Catholic experience, and I think it's similar to the Orthodox experience, where the blinding moment isn't the moment, that part of what the faith is, that is having to deal with doubt all the time, and that's the relationship that you have as a communicant with the church. And I thought that was an interesting observation, because I feel like there's something about the fact that I grew up Orthodox, and there's something about that you carry that culture, and you carry that heritage, and you carry that knowledge into everything you do. That maybe made me see Paul in a different light to the Paul we have, because he's so fundamentally important to your traditions as Protestants, Paul. But I'm not scared of the doubt. That's part of the process of what. And I'll lay my cards on the table. I can't call myself a Christian anymore. And we can talk about that later if you like. But I do absolutely respect the faith, and I actually think it's so important to understand how we are formed, and how someone like myself, how my ethics are formed through my engagement with Christianity.
Thanks. Fergus, why don't we draw you into the conversation?
Okay.
What's your reaction to the book?
Well, my reaction to the book is that I found, what I'm going to say might sound very critical or negative, but I actually found it an incredibly difficult book to read. I read it as someone who comes from a classical education, as a classicist and then a biblical scholar. And so I think I'm familiar with the ancient world. But the power of the historical fiction was to me to bring home the grimness of the ancient world in a way that my academic reading had never done. And this is one of the few books I've not been able to sit and read my way through. I was saying to Gavin, who's over there, the last book I really read seriously that wasn't sort of theology was anecdotes about the women on the women soldiers on the Eastern Front in World War II. Compared to your novel, theirs was a bagatelle. I didn't have to put that novel down, partly because it was anecdotal and bitty and recovered, but there were points where I just had to say, no, I've read enough for the moment, I need to put it down, I need to recover, and I need to come back from it. And from that point of view, it's been a really productive exercise to read. I was also delighted incidentally by what you said about wanting to rehabilitate Paul, because I think one of the problems we have with Paul is he's been so badly let down by his interpreters that the focus has become on the select passages which are cherry-picked as misogynistic or homophobic or anti-Semitic. And I question whether any of those is actually a right adjective to use about Paul as a personality, especially anti-Semitic. He was a Jew arguing with Jews.
Yes.
It's very difficult to describe that as anti-Semitic in the unfortunate ways in which that has developed within Western society. I'm interested in what you were just saying about being Orthodox, because of course you read Paul as an Orthodox Christian without the lens of Martin Luther and justification by faith, and that's important as well. That makes Paul a very different character too. So those were things that, and lastly, of course, because you mentioned faith and doubt, I always have to quote G.K. Chesterton, who said, there is more faith in honest doubt than in certainty. So those were points that came out. I had two things that I really wanted to discuss or to raise that again came out from your novel. One was, I think I got an impression, and I think you validated my reading, that you see that Judeo-Christianity, Paul's legacy, has actually been an incredible force for social transformation and change in society. That it's given, in many ways, a respect for life that was absent in that Roman society in which you bring home the brutal realities of the exposure of children and gladiatorial and, life being taken as entertainment. And for me, it then brought home that there's that recognition that many people have had, and I would say one of the people you walk with in this regard is Mahatma Gandhi, who see the force for good that Paul's legacy has been and that Jesus' legacy have been, but yet have had difficulties to make that, if you like, owning that as a personal faith or as a vehicle for personal as well as social and societal transformation. Because of reasons that you again also mentioned beautifully in what you've just said in the autobiographical passage at the end and the few remarks you said at the beginning. Sometimes people cannot make that step into a personal acceptance of faith in all its fullness for epistemic reasons. What my professor in New Testament once said, it's like Lewis Carroll. People expected to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast and they just can't do it. Sometimes it's because there's an ethical dimension to it. And I think you've brought that to, is that sometimes the message as presented just makes something which is just a bridge too far or a step too far that people cannot go with because of their integrity about how they recognize their own identity and questions like this. The last thing, and yet it actually comes out in your novel as well, there's a little passage where in one of the congregations where the leader of the congregation, I think it's Timothy, gets criticized because there are prostitutes in the congregation. They're sitting there unveiled. By the way, that was really helpful for an article I'm writing. That visual imagery of veiling was really, really helpful for a piece of research I'm doing with Dorothy Lee at the moment. The third reason why often people are put off Christianity is because what some well-meaning Christian has said to them and just absolutely, to use a Scottish, absolutely scunnered them or made them feel that this is impossible for them. And
Which I think is what happened to me.
And that raises a number of questions about how, as Christians, we ensure that we are being faithful to the legacy of Christ. Because one of the things I would bring from my experience through life is it's really easy for Christians to be very hardline on matters of identity which are not their problem. They're not issues in their own life. It's so easy to be hardline, putting it really simply and crudely, on what doesn't tempt you.
Yeah.
And so I think that was the first question. The first point I wanted to bring out, yeah.
I was going to say, do you want to respond to Fergus at this
Oh,
point?
look, I mean, again, I'm just really, thank you for that engagement with what I'm doing. I mean, there's a lot there, so I'll try and pass it, you know. That, Paul, you were talking about the you know, how I wrote the conversion moment. You know, for me, yes, I'm keeping faith that something happened there at that moment, and I am trying to interpret it in a fictional sense. But what was really for me a moment of, and it's truly like a revelation, is in the thinking about Christ, thinking about Paul, thinking about these people at this point of time, is the fact that the Saviour is a man on the crucifix. Like that shock, that scandal that Paul refers to. You know, I that for me is the most revelatory moment in what I experienced writing this book, is to be reminded of that. That this faith came out of an understanding of the absolute horror of what can be done to the soul, to the person in this world, and part of that in relationship to what you were saying as a theologian and a classicist coming to understanding the first century, is for me, the more I read, I realised that there are very, very few moments where I was reading, and I was reading, you know, between the 4th century BC and, you know, before the Common Era, and the 3rd century, nothing about the experience of the slave and the poor person, and that was a dominant life in the ancient world, in the Roman world, unless you read the Gospels. That was, and Paul was not a nobleman. Paul was not, you know, he was not of that kind of class. For me, that again was a revelation, and I wanted to, you know, I think for me, that is still what I think is fundamental and phenomenal and important about the Jewish Christian experience. That notion of that God exists. You know, the way I've been putting it is, you know, you cross over the beggar on the Princess Street Bridge. That's where Christ is, isn't he? Yeah. That's where we have to find him, and that's what I'd forgotten until I started work on this book. And what I was reminded of, and what I realise is what is the legacy that I owe to my Christian upbringing, and I'm really grateful for that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense as well. And if I can just add one comment into it, what your perception about the ancient world is absolutely right, because with the exception of things like the Oxyrhynchi papyrus that have been found in the rubbish tips in Egypt, graffiti from Pompeii, the literature that we have from the ancient world is the survival of the writings of the elite class. The majority of society remain anonymous. We get little glimpses of them, perhaps most of it, and they're in distorted forms in the comedies and in the novels. The novels like Petronius, and there you tend to be dealing with stock characters. So what you say is absolutely right, is that we do not understand in many ways what a leveling of a whole society based on honor and shame and stratification. The Christian congregation, in which, not to quote Paul but James, the idea of acting out of reciprocity because you're going to get something back out of the transaction gets put aside. It's completely and utterly subversive. Paul's advice to Philemon on welcoming back the slave, Onesimus, is just, if you can't eradicate structural slavery, subvert the institution as best you can in your local place. And it's the only way that a small, tiny, countercultural movement like Christianity could ever have had any impact. So I think you're exactly right with your insights on the ancient world.
And just on what the other thing I wanted to say, and really, and this is as a writer of fiction in terms of what you were saying, and this is about Paul. One of the things that one of the biggest challenge as a writer of this book was to create a language that could place you in the first century. You know, that was the biggest challenge and the hardest actual endeavour as someone who works in the craft of fiction. And the other thing that I worry about is this tendency to, how was consciousness 2,000 years ago? Mm-hmm. It's a huge question, and I was scared that how do you do it without sounding either like the Life of Brian, that it can only be observed, or that it sounds arch and false from the opening sentence. And I've talked about this as well, but I think it is important. I came to Melbourne Uni. I was a student here. I was doing the arts. It was under it was at a time when postmodernism was the way we were all trained to think in the fine art, in the arts, right? And one of the things that was being taught to me was that humanism actually, it was the worst insult to be called a humanist, right? At the time, I'm talking about the 80s, and in the research, but also in the reading of Paul, in reading Paul in Galatians, it was just like I found a sense of these are people, and they are not me, and it would be a lie to say they think like me. I am the 20th and 21st century. I understand that. But you read and they knew love. Yeah. Then you read and they knew suffering. You read and they knew compassion. You read and they knew hatred. And I had to be, in a way, I will not be scared of writing them as human characters. So, and sorry, but it wasn't. This is important. I also didn't want to write Paul as a 21st century person. Yeah. Right? And sometimes I think in my field as fiction, in fiction at the moment, we are in the danger of always thinking that we are superior to the past. So that it would have been, I think that is an unfair way of understanding history, and that's a terribly unfair way of understanding someone like Paul.
Yes.
To assume that he is on the dock in the 21st century. Yeah. I think what do I know of Paul is, what I really know of Paul are the letters that we have, and that is confusing. And I will end my time still kind of working out what is in those letters. But I don't see him as this kind of horrible, hateful man that he's sometimes portrayed as in contemporary thought. Yeah.
Thank you. Brian, what about you? What's your response to the book, and what would you like to quiz Christos on or ask him about? Or
the place of Philippi wasn't high on my list. I think the great achievement of the book for me is similar to Fergus. There was a report today on the radio about the Closing the Gap project, and what you've done for us is open the gap, if you like, to remind us how different the first century was to our day. And one of the key texts for understanding Paul's life and mission is in one of his letters to the Thessalonians, where he says to the Thessalonians that they turn to God from idols, to the true and living God, and to wait for his Son from heaven. And that, in a sense, is a summary of what you've given to us, I think, at its best. The depiction of idolatry in all of its horror and the way it enslaved people, the fear it produced. Now, my first degree was in English, so I'll give a few specifics of the things I liked about the book, just in those terms as well, if that's okay. So the first sentence is, the world is in darkness, and that's just with a few spoilers, that's about a woman who's got a hood over her head who's about to be stoned to death. Yep. But then the motif of light comes right through the book so beautifully, and you remember that opening scene. It's very moving. The great achievement of the book is to remind us how incredible the Christian Revolution was, if you like, because it's a very positive portrayal in some ways of justice and mercy, which is true of the early Christian movement, compared to the brutality and evil, really, you would say, of the ancient world. So Lydia's husband, who's not a believer, says, slaves mingle with free men, women and men pray together, beggars and orphans stand side by side with merchants and traders. And then, speaking of the husband, his voice was hoarse with disgust at such shamelessness, such madness. So it just reminds us that the vision of the Christian church and the Christian life that many of us are so fond of was so different and was such a revolutionary vision in the first century. Who doesn't hate us? Who doesn't want to destroy us? At one point, a character says, the Romans scorn us, the Greeks despise us, the righteous Jews shun us, and all of the unbaptized laugh at us. So just in terms of literature, I think it's a great read. There are some bits I want to push back on, but that's the first thing to say. Just to give you a sense of the literary artistry, though, at one point, Paul's jailer is introduced with two other men at the beginning of a chapter, and the sentence goes for 3 pages without any punctuation.
Was that bad editing?
There's clearly no editing.
And you read along, but it worked for me. It worked. It's about the fever pitch desire to please the gods. The blood's dripping on them. They're eating raw flesh. I'm sorry for the description, but that's what it's like. And you know what he wants? He wants the gods to give him, his already pregnant wife, to give him a son. Yeah, so much of the ancient world in all of its starkness and its difference comes through in the book, and I thank you for that. Now, sometimes, as a reader though, I cry in books, not in movies, so I feel the book quite heavily. So I'll give you an example. So there's a couple of pages with a very graphic description of Paul circumcising Timothy. And then a few pages later, Timothy has a nightmare about it. And a few hours later, I have a nightmare about it. So there is that going on. Now, just pushing back a little to let people know who haven't read the book, there are some things in there that are not New Testament. They're really based on later apocryphal bits. So Thomas, the twin, which is what it means in Greek, is Jesus' brother, Jesus' twin brother. So that's quite striking. It reminds me of the Noah film some years back with...
Yes.
So they get on the ark and there's a stowaway.
Yes.
And I just think, what's that about? And that's how I reacted to Thomas as the twin. Now, I know you used it to kind of contrast 2 different forms of Christian faith, one very earthy and one more heavenly minded, and that kind of works. But for me, nonetheless, it was a little difficult. Any response to any of that?
Well, thank you. That's my first response. Thank you. It's one of the things that became really important, just as thinking about, as I said, there was a certain responsibility I felt in writing Damascus about doing it in good faith, and that was thinking about the relationship of Judaism to Christianity, right? And so you're talking about justice, and one things that you kept finding in the historical record was the relationship of the God-fearers to the Jewish people, that there was actually, it's just important that there was, for me, that always to be present in the book is the sense of that these ideas owe something, their roots are in Judaism as well. I think there is something actually incredibly revolutionary about Christ's teachings that are apart, but they are also in relationship to Judaism, right? So that's just something I want to, that I'm very happy to talk about and argue about, but that is really crucial when it comes to understanding how justice is in the book. I'm really tempted to ask you all about Vrasas because I really like Vrasas, and even though his code is kind of anathema to me, but there's something about honour, and again, I'm sorry to go back to it, but I think this culture does. There's something about the word shame was also you talked, right? So something about shame and honour, and that is really strong in the Eastern traditions that I think kind of have an effect on how some of the book works and the choices I made in the book. Thomas, for me, Brian, I had the reading of the Gospel of Thomas, like the Nag Hammadi, from the Nag Hammadi documents, was, again, I just, because I didn't know it, and to read Jesus' sayings without kind of resurrection being part of the story that I tell myself about who Christ is. I was seduced by it. There's no other word. I was seduced by it, and also a sense. And again, it'd be interesting to get your response as ministers to this. A little anger about traditions ways that faith could have gone if we had known those texts, if we could have been able to argue about them for over the centuries. So it felt like kind of that was one of the impulses in creating Thomas. And this is where fiction comes into play, and this is where storytelling comes into play. The more I thought about a man who has to bury his twin, the more I thought, how do I talk about the conflicts I have with Paul? How do I talk about the conflicts I have with Christianity? That struggle between Thomas and Paul became one of the things that I used as a fiction writer to communicate that struggle.
I know Fergus wanted to say something or ask you about Thomas as well.
I was going to comment on Thomas, but first, before that, you just mentioned honour and shame. When I first studied New Testament in Edinburgh in the 1980s, it was a very philological discipline, strongly influenced by Germanic methodology. One of the things that has come through in the 1990s and the 2000s has been a social scientific and social critical reading of the New Testament, in which honour and shame are the dominant lens of trying to analyse what is going on. So you're spot on the money with having identified those as themes that show up the difference between emerging Christianity and the ancient world, and the other cultures of the ancient world. You couldn't have put it any more succinctly in getting honour and shame so much to the forefront of the narrative. With Thomas, the problem again that I have is that, and it comes from. I'm sorry, there's a sort of there's a number of knee-jerk reactions that came in from reading the book. The first is you quoted Bart Ehrman. That's a knee-jerk reaction for me, because Bart Ehrman is a writer who generates a sensational headline from which he then constantly steps back. And the other one is that there can be a tendency sometimes in looking at things like the Gospel of Thomas. Oh, it was very popular in the 80s. People read it, really liked it. Feminist theologians got very excited about the Gospel of Thomas until they got to the verse at the end that said, unless a woman becomes a man, she cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. At which stage they lost interest with remarkable rapidity. For obvious reasons. But the problem that often comes in trying to assess the competing values of these claims is that there can be a tendency, and it comes out time after time in those sensational documentaries that you see in the History Channel, where suddenly this new document is presented as ideologically pure compared to the corrupt doctrines of orthodoxy which are permeating the canonical Gospels. The fact of the matter is they come from the same time frame.
Yes.
And because Gospel of Thomas is dated between 40 to 140. The Gospels come from roughly the same time frame, the canonical Gospels, especially if we bear in mind that they are drawn out of the oral traditions that before the Gospels actually go into, if you like, writing in the late 60s CE and onwards. Or, of course, if you follow John A.T. Robinson, all before 70 AD or 70 CE. And they're all essentially competing ideological documents. And that was just the one thing I wanted to bring out. It would be bring out for a Christian audience reflecting on the text that you've brought in for them to consider as part of the narrative. Is actually, it's not that we need to suddenly go, ooh, Thomas, the twin undermines his. And no, Thomas the twin who may be identified with Judas, is every bit as an ideological construct as the Jesus of John's Gospel, Matthew's Gospel, Mark's Gospel, or Luke's Gospel. And that's a rather recherche way of saying you've got to negotiate your way around. We all have to negotiate our way around the competing claims of a huge variety of early Christian texts.
Yes.
So I disagree with Thomas as the twin, and I did sit uneasily to it, but that probably says as much about my ideology and my presuppositions and prejudices as anything else.
I have to say, I had a friend say in their Christmas manger they put 2 babies in this year. I do really understand that, Fergus, and I think that is also the point of where I have to. Where I think the fact of my no longer being Christian in that means that I come to the story. For me, I cannot claim this enough. How important the Jesus I read in the Gospels is to me, to the way I still think in the world, right? Yeah. In the way I try to live my life. And the shame I feel when I don't live up to what I have received from the Gospels. And part of what I received from the Gospels are the way Paul has at times helped me understand them, and has sometimes, in my argument with him, kind of made me interpret him in my, understand him in a different light. But it is still, I think, light. But I don't believe in the resurrection. I don't. I would be a lie for me then to call myself a Christian. And I said this to someone a long while ago, but I think it holds true. I feel my relationship to Christianity is a little bit like my relationship to something called Marxism. Yeah. Right? That I can no longer, in good faith, call myself a Marxist, because I have seen I have seen or understood tragedies done in the name of that ideology. But that isn't to say that in a long engagement with that tradition, there are ways I think about class and the ways I think about social justice and the world that are important to me. That's how I feel about Christianity as well, except to say that I feel the older I get, a greater affinity with the Christian ethic than I do with the Marxist ethic.
Brian.
We don't want to lecture on the apocryphal Gospels again, but my take would be that the Gospel of Thomas is not as reliably historical, but that's just another matter. And the other thing to say is just a small point, but I understand that the twin of Jesus being Thomas is really a 3rd century document as well. So it's long removed from the 1st century. It's really Christian fiction is the way I would understand it. But anyway, I just want to emphasise again just how helpful the distance that you open up for us is, and just, for example, the smells. I don't know if this is deliberate or not, but in the first 50 pages you read of foul odours, stinging eyes, milky smells of a newborn, the abrasive smell of brine, that's brine, not brine, reek of blood, the rank stench of the rotting of the crucified. So it just immerses you in a context that's so helpful for when you come back to read the New Testament. And that's all helpful, but just pushing back the other way, why did Timothy have to commit suicide, and why did Philemon have to get bashed?
No, he did.
So there are a couple of examples that...
Onesimus.
Oh, Onesimus, yes. Yeah, Onesimus. Yeah.
Okay. So
in other words, don't misunderstand me.
No.
The brutality is very helpful through the book, but I just wondered, and most of the time it seems to have an obvious purpose, but just pushing back, occasionally it seemed gratuitous. Those two examples.
So with the moment with Vrasas, the Roman jailer, and Abel. So how do you convey to you as a reader how outrageous and vile it was to this pagan when he, these madmen. That's
The
what
runaway slave.
Yeah, he's protecting a runaway slave.
Yeah.
You know what is due to the runaway slave? That he'd be hung up on the crucifix and just die the most horrific of deaths. That is his due.
Yeah, okay.
So how do I convey that? It's at the moment he overhears and realises that boy, and he's only a boy, is a runaway slave. And it's in his reaction to that. It's in the violence that he does that I want the reader to understand that world. Because this is the moment, and I owe this to a friend of mine, Fortis, and again, a long, long time ago, because I've been talking about this stuff for a long time. And it goes back, Brian, to what I wanted to say about the importance of, and it's in Timothy's chapter. I actually do refer to this, of what any of us who, whether we call ourselves Christian or we say we come, how important, how central this tradition is to who we are. Fortis was sitting down with me one night over drinks, getting drunk, and working these things out, trying to talk about this. What was the ancient world like? And Fortis is a big reader of the classics, and he said to me, imagine you are one of those slave girls or one of those slave boys in the arena, right? You're going to be torn apart by animals. You may be multiple times raped. And they're in the historical records, like what was happening in those circuses. And you hear that there's this mob over here who say, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, right? Which, okay, is that savage? In 2020, it's savage? Not if you're a slave boy or a slave girl back then. That at least is justice. That at least you can understand, right? You steal something, you get your hand cut off. You can't. What is insane is that because you were born to this condition, that they can do whatever they like to you. That is the insanity of the slave world that I wanted to convey. And so I'm defending myself to say that the violence that Vrasas enacts is a way of me communicating to you guys, this is the world that these people lived in.
Yep.
This is the world where this faith came from.
Yep. To give a more positive example, I just love the Lydia chapter, which again is gut-wrenching because Lydia, her husband's not a believer, and Lydia has a disabled child and takes her away to protect her. And at the end of the chapter reads, speaking of Jesus' return, soon he will come back, I am bathed in light, soon he will return, and my salvation, my daughter, will awaken to a kinder world. So beautiful. So I don't want to give the wrong impression. It's not all brutality. There's some wonderful moments where you see
Fergus.
light shining through, and the motif of light's so important, I think.
I actually did with Lydia with that line you quoted from the Gospel of Thomas. I mean, I have, in a way, I'm doing this saying she has to leave her children behind. She has to leave her marriage, her life behind too. I mean, that in that sense, she has to become a man, because so otherwise there is no option for her.
Yeah, because infanticide is what we're talking about. This child would have been killed.
And Timothy, God, I thought a lot about because the infanticide, that notion, that experience of leaving, abandoning the child to those caves, to those hilltops, to those crags. It's so central to Lydia. When I was, how do I end Timothy? And I wanted to end him returning to that scene, to have that it mirrors what we see with Lydia is mirrored in Timothy's end. And I guess I thought, because suicide is suicide. It is a sin, and he knows it's a sin. But I hope I've created a Timothy who is saying, I am a sinner to his Lord.
Oh, it's a sympathetic portrayal of Timothy. That's what made the suicide so difficult, I think. Yeah.
He knows he's at his end of his time, so he wants to be in that world that is so shocking and horrific, but which is why he has anchored himself to this faith, because it is the one faith that says there is a world that is not this world. And that's what I was hoping to do.
When in reading that section, I was thinking of the beginning of 2 Timothy, Paul's letter. So God has not given you a spirit of cowardice, but a spirit of love and power and self-control. And I just sort of thought to myself, maybe Timothy was timid and a coward, and you were echoing that warning. I wondered overall if the work of the Spirit of God in transformation and strengthening is perhaps underplayed. But that goes back to the earlier comment about doubt and confidence and things like that, I think, as well.
It's a good, I think, guys, that is a good, it's really hard to be objective about Damascus at this point, because it's not, it's been a long time, working on it, and it's just, but I think if there's something about the experience, every book you write, you want to go back and, in hindsight, there's something about the notion of grace that I think is something I would like one more last attempt to deal with that.
So is the next novel on Peter? Fergus.
Just while I struggle with the suicide of Timothy, at the risk of not being an English lit scholar, the character that Timothy the value I saw in the suicide scene and the death of Timothy was that it stopped Timothy becoming a perfect Christian. Because one of the dangers we always face is becoming a perfect church, and if we're not actually a perfect church, we're a church that's full of broken people. The character that Timothy reminded me of through that last movement was Graham Greene's Whiskey Priest in the Power and the Glory. This idea that a broken Christian, aware of their imperfections, their brokenness, as Paul puts it, the treasure in an earthen vessel, can actually still accomplish so much. And it just stopped Timothy becoming goody two-shoes who was just too perfect, although I struggle with the suicide.
For me, yes. I fight very strongly against the tendency of being goody-goody. The thing is, to really engage with to what it is to be human is to deal with the fact that we keep falling, in a language, if I was a Christian, it would be we keep falling into sin. In my terminology, we keep falling into the shameful. We keep falling into doing. Well, it is evil. We do wrong, and you keep wanting to find ways to deal with that too.
Paul in Romans 7.
Yes. So Timothy for me is that long, and it's a long kind of end requiem that I've created for Timothy is about that. And the other thing, and again, it comes back to culture because, and I will keep repeating this, culture is really important. I do think coming from the eastern side of these complicated relationship, which is the Christian church, remember his father is not Christian. His father is a man of Vras's code, where suicide meant something very, very different to what it means for us.
Christos, we're very grateful for your time today.
I'm very grateful to you guys.
I don't know why you needed to be nervous, but your book says this is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are sometimes based on historical events, but are used fictitiously. I take comfort in that, as I have Paul and Thomas in prison in Caesarea Maritima. I think, I can cope with that bit, actually, a bit more than some of the others. But thank you so much for a stimulating book.
Thank you so much. And can I just say to all of you, to the three of you, this has been really important because, I was nervous because I'm dealing with a book about your faith. I know that. So if we can continue the conversation, I'm more than happy to do so.
We're delighted with your vulnerability and honesty, Christos. It's been terrific to have you speak so passionately.
Thank you very much.